several reminders that COVID-19 is very much still with us and perhaps wasn't contained in the first place. In America, cases have now passed 2.1 million. Another 116,000 people have died. The virus shows no sign of slowing there. In the past 2 weeks, 19 US states have seen the number of new cases go up. These are just a few of them, and in many of these states, restrictions had eased. Well, let's take a look at Texas, Florida and Arizona, which all reported their biggest one-day increases. California came next with 2,108 cases recorded in just a single day. The US is the worst affected by COVID-19 in the world by far. And if you look at how it stacks up against some European countries, here you have the UK, Spain and Italy, which, as we know, were badly affected by coronavirus. However, nowhere has the level been matched to that of America. Well, for most, those statistics would be eye-watering. However, President Trump, who is planning a campaign rally in Tulsa this weekend, attributed it to this, taking to Twitter, of course. He said, "Our testing is so much bigger and more advanced than any other country. We've done a great job on this, that it shows more cases. Without testing or weak testing, we would be showing almost no cases. Testing is a double-edged sword, makes us look bad, but good to have." Well, his Vice President Mike Pence downplayed it too. In the Wall Street Journal, he wrote, "In recent days, the media has taken to sounding the alarm bells over a second wave of coronavirus infections. Such panic is overblown. The government's top infectious disease expert, Anthony Fauci, has spoken to the Wall Street Journal, but stressed another point. He said the US is very much still in a first wave of infections. He gave a reason for this, saying, "When I look at the TV and I see pictures of people congregating at bars when the location they are in indicates they shouldn't be doing that, it's very risky." And in perhaps a direct message to the president, he added this, that the rise of positive tests across states cannot be explained by increased testing. Jeff Flake was a Republican senator and a longtime critic of President Trump. This is his take on the spike in numbers.
I think the states, governors, mayors and others, by and large, are reacting as they should. They're trying to balance the needs of their constituents to get back to work and for an economy that's functioning so that we can address situations like this. I don't think the federal leadership has been particularly good, but governors and mayors and others, by and large, I think are treating it as they should.
Well, one of the hotspots of the pandemic has been New York. Neither traffic, is there?
Once the epicenter of the national COVID epidemic, New York now has one of the country's lowest infection rates. The once eerily quiet streets are buzzing back with life, but it's nowhere near back to normal. Restrictions are just slowly easing. The mayor says even outdoor dining won't be allowed until July. But across the nation, coronavirus cases are on the rise, with hotspots in the South and the Southwest. Just yesterday, infection rates hit record highs in 6 states, including Oklahoma, where President Trump plans to hold a rally on Saturday, his first in months. In Texas, restaurants were forced to close due to outbreaks after recently reopening at 75% capacity. In Oregon, 200 new cases were linked to a church. And while the Trump administration has tried to argue that the rise in infections is due to more testing and not reopening, hospitalization rates are also reaching record highs in some areas. Now, projections aren't too optimistic. Across the nation, cases could continue to rise in August and September, assuming schools reopen.
Well, America's response to the pandemic has been split along party lines. Reuters helps us explain why. According to its analysis in May, Democratic deaths from COVID-19 were triple Republicans' ones. We know the disease took hold in densely packed Democratic voting cities like New York and Chicago. However, 1 month on, and that pattern of infection is changing. The Economist reports the infections are rising fastest outside the biggest cities first afflicted and now taking root in Republican voting areas. William Fry is a demographer and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's been looking into the coronavirus numbers across the US and joins me from Washington. Very good of you to join us. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. Looking then at the US map of the virus and how things have progressed, what are you understanding, given that there was a school of thought that this was perhaps only limited towards those states that were leaning towards politics that were democratic? Now, would you say that's completely misguided?
I think it really is a bad way to look at it. Early on in this epidemic, it absolutely was the case that democratic states, especially very urban areas in democratic states, were at the core of this virus. But really, since the end of April, and now for the past 3 weeks particularly, the movement is to the south and to the west, to states that are either Republican states or what we would call swing states, and that means in the next election, they could either go Democratic or Republican, and you mentioned Arizona and Texas could be in that category, as well as Florida. And it's ramping up in those areas, and particularly in the small towns in the rural areas of those states. Those are the most Republican parts of those states, the areas that initially the president sort of warded off and said, well, we don't really need to take too much precaution here. This is mostly an urban blue state type of pandemic.
It's really interesting, though, when there are much research and poring over the numbers when the initial outbreak in those democratic states. I mean, for you, what was the direct link then?
Well, I think initially what was going on was this was happening in very racially diverse, high-density urban areas. And, you know, at the end of March, most of the cases were in the New York metropolitan area. And clearly that's a Democratic bastion. But as we move into the end of April, things have moved out to the Midwest and especially the South, the southern part of the United States, states like Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. And now, more recently, in Texas, the last 3 weeks had a huge growth in the pandemic in Texas, taking over more counties and more cases. And we also see that in North Carolina and Arizona and Florida. And, you know, I'm not a public health person, I'm a demographer. But I look at very carefully at the demography of this spread, and I see this is moving to parts of the country that really are not urban at all, and it's spreading on a week-by-week basis, especially in what we call the Sun Belt, the south and west regions of the United States.
Let's move to China, where the virus originated. The capital, Beijing, is now at the centre of another outbreak. More than 1,200 flights have been cancelled, and railway services have been reduced until at least the 9th of July. Primary school, middle school and college classes have been suspended, sports teams cannot play, and swimming pools and gyms, they've all been closed. The outbreak is believed to have started in the massive Xingvandi food market that supplies 80% of the city's meat and vegetables. At least 27 neighbourhoods have been classed as medium risk, and one neighbourhood near the market is high risk. People in medium or high risk areas cannot leave the city, and people in low risk areas can leave but need to test negative first. With more, here's Steve McDonald in Beijing.
The difference this time, when we compare it to when the coronavirus first took off, is that businesses and government departments are remaining open, at least for now. And that is giving people, well, some confidence that the authorities are going to be able to control this. What they're trying to do at the moment is to sort of treat Beijing as many cities within a city. And so they're kind of isolating pockets of the population, locking it down there, hoping they can control this outbreak without having to shut down this enormous city of 20 million people.
Well, next to New Zealand and Germany, two success stories of the pandemic are now dealing with their outbreaks. First, northwestern Germany for you, where 7,000 people have been told to go into quarantine after an outbreak at a major meat processing plant near Gütersloh. More than 400 workers at the plant have tested positive for the disease. The abattoir, schools and nurseries in the area, they've all been closed. In Berlin, more than 300 households are under quarantine after dozens tested positive for COVID-19. The outbreak involves 6 apartment buildings. Well, let's update you now on New Zealand, which has recorded its first new cases in 3 weeks. In the past 24 hours, the military has been put in charge of the country's quarantine and border operations. The cases relate to 2 women who flew in from the UK to visit a dying relative. They were given permission to leave quarantine early and travelled from Auckland to Wellington. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, said the system failed. This is what she said.
This case represents an unacceptable failure of the system.
It should never have happened, and it cannot be repeated. I'm the first to acknowledge that the decision we've made here to suspend compassionate leave will not be a popular one for many, but I have to prioritise the health, safety and well-being of New Zealanders. That is my job, and so my view is until we can have complete confidence in the system, that is the best course of action on behalf of New Zealand.